Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we dig into the morality of Christian economics. In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by Samuel Gregg, Director of Research at the Acton Institute and author of many books on economics and religion, including his most recent, Tea Party Catholic. Up first, we're pleased to have Larry Reed, President of the Foundation for Economic Education and author of the provocative polemic, Was Jesus a Socialist? You can download for free from fee.org. Larry, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thank you, Bill. It's always a pleasure.
Larry, despite Karl Marx's atheism, the left has always claimed Jesus as one of their own. And Christians have long been divided into two camps on this. You know, you can call one the Max Weber Protestant ethic crowd and maybe call the other one the South American liberation theology crowd. Your book makes the case that Jesus was not a socialist. Tell us why.
Well, I believe very strongly, Bill, that when you read what Jesus himself said, there's no way you can come to the conclusion that he was a socialist. Now, much depends upon how you define socialism. There are plenty of socialists who will not admit that behind the velvet glove of socialism is an iron fist, but ultimately the current political, social, economic context in which we understand socialism, we understand that socialism is a system that requires the force of government for any number of objectives, redistribute wealth or to put government in charge of planning the economy or to take over property, own private property by government. So all of those things require the use of force. Socialism is not, as Mikhail Gorbachev once said, simply the desire for a better life. I mean, who doesn't desire a better life? So when you look at Jesus' words, you cannot find, and I could not find as an economist, I admit I'm not a theologian, but I could not find any place where Christ called for the force of government, the political process, to redistribute wealth from one to another. That's not to say he wasn't an advocate of compassion or personal initiative in meeting the needs of those around us, but he never called for government to do it.
Isn't the threat of hell a bit of an iron fist?
Well, it certainly is, but ultimately, this is the nature of the environment in which we find ourselves. So we are the clay, not the potter, and in the sense that God has created the world with certain conditions. Now, we are free to go in another direction. On matters of free will, individuals can spurn the message of the Bible completely. We're not required in this earthly life to accept Christ as our personal Savior. But yeah, there are consequences to that, just as if you walk off a cliff, there are consequences to that. But I would advise that you not make that choice.
Okay. Let's dig into the text and maybe have some fun with it. The golden rule, as expressed in Matthew 7:12, has been called by some a logical inversion because it's stated in the positive and not the negative. You know, the negative would be, don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. That's the libertarian version. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, logically leads to surrendering all your property for the good of others. Isn't that what socialism is all about?
Socialism is the surrendering of property, some or all of it, upon the demands of government. It's not a voluntary arrangement, but the golden rule basically says if you don't want to have someone seize your property, for example, well, then don't seize theirs. Treat others the way you want others to treat you. I don't see in that any automatic endorsement of the use of political force to accomplish your ends.
In your book, you respond to the criticism of the biblical warning that it would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, with the classic retort that it's the love of money that's wicked, not the earning of money. Francisco d'Anconia's speech from Atlas Shrugged, which is probably the most famous fictional speech on money ever written, takes exception to that defense. He says that the lovers of money are willing to work for it because they know they're able to deserve it. What's your response to that?
Well, in a sense, I love money as an economist because I see it as an effective media of exchange. It facilitates trades. It makes possible standards of living that would otherwise not be possible. In that sense, I think it's a wonderful invention. But that's not to say that I worship it. It's not to say that I allow it to rule my life. It's not to say that I singularly focus on money and its accumulation at the expense of other people or my other responsibilities. Paul makes it plain in the Bible that it is the love of money, and I think by that he would mean the inordinate focus and worship of it, that is an evil, not the accumulation of it in itself. And I think he'd be the first to say, as Christ would too, that there's nothing wrong with enjoying the accumulation of wealth when it arises because you've created things, you've peacefully traded with other people, you've improved lives in the process as well as your own.
Well, one of the things that's certainly changed quite a bit since Jesus' time is the fundamentals of economics and even the language of economics. The idea to make money is very American, as opposed to get money, which, throughout history, it's been in a process of taking from others almost more than creating. Are you saying that Jesus foresaw the United States of America?
Well, of course, if you believe that Jesus was God and knows all things, in a sense, yeah, he foresaw all things. But I think what he's saying with regard to money is that it is a wonderful means to accumulate wealth. It's a testimony to how well you have served others, as long as the economy is free and you're not out there using government to accumulate money. But otherwise, don't focus on it, don't worship it, don't think that it is the end of life in and of itself.
Your book makes a key point of distinguishing between private virtue and public law, particularly public law at the point of a gun. And you make a couple of interesting, funny comments about exceptions to the admonition, thou shalt not steal. Take us through some of that.
Okay. Of course, we're speaking of the Ten Commandments. The 8th and the 10th in particular are the two that I think speak to private property issues. Thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not covet. And in those two commandments, they both end with a period. There are no qualifications. It does not say, for instance, thou shalt not steal unless the other guy has more than you do, or thou shalt not steal unless you can find a politician who will do it on your behalf, or thou shalt not steal unless you're just absolutely convinced you can spend the money better than the person to whom it belongs in the first place. It says, if it's not yours, don't take it, and don't covet it either.
Does this imply that the IRS is going against the laws of Jesus?
Well, now you're asking me to put words in Jesus' mouth, and I want to be very careful about that. I do think that Jesus would be appalled at the tactics that the government uses with the IRS to get its money it claims. I think he would also be appalled at how much it claims. And I know he would be appalled at what it spends most of its money on.
Everyone, of course, knows Jesus' famous retort, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, a great bit of sophistry to avoid being arrested for sedition. Walk us through that.
Yes, a lot of people look to that and they say, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And they assume that that means that whatever Caesar claims must be his and you should fork it over for whatever purpose. That's not what Christ says. I can see within that statement a pretty strong defense of property. He's basically saying, look, if it belongs to Caesar, we'll give it to him. But he doesn't say, what belongs to Caesar is whatever Caesar says he wants, and it doesn't matter what he proposes to use it for, or it doesn't matter how he proposes to get it from you. Those are other issues, but it clearly says if it belongs to Caesar, just as Christ would say if it belongs to anybody, and they demand it, well then if it's theirs, give it to them. But to read into that some kind of statement on behalf of massive redistribution of wealth and squandering of other people's money through government bureaucracy, that's quite a leap.
So, Larry, many people have said that the closest you can get to Jesus in his own words is the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe we can take a look through some of the economic passages in there, and you can give us an analysis. You go down and you see a phrase that says, give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. Isn't that just another version of to each according to his needs and from each according to his abilities?
Well, I don't see it that way, and I certainly don't see that must involve in any way a third party, the state, to assess a person's needs and to use the force of government to take from those who have it. I think that's quite a leap from what Christ is saying. Keep in mind that Christ never said, hey, listen up, I'm going to tell you about what government can do and what it can't do, what it should do, what it shouldn't do. He's addressing people and saying, here's how you should live your life. Here's how you should interact and relate to other people around you. And he is saying you should have a generous heart. You should help those around you. But he's not saying if you don't do it, then we're going to have to call the cops and get it done on your behalf and take the money from you. There's no leap to that conclusion that's justified in my view.
Well, except if you don't live a virtuous life, we're going to send you to eternal damnation.
Well, that's right. He still leaves it up to you as to whether or not you choose to live a virtuous life. I suppose a person might decide, okay, I believe that there will be an accounting at the end of life, and that if I don't do as I'm advised, I may go where I don't want to go, but that's my choice.
What's the value of the preaching to people who don't believe there's going to be a heavenly accounting after life on earth?
Gee, there's a message in Christianity that is applicable to all, to everybody. Even if you don't buy the notion, as Christians do, that Christ himself was God incarnate and is asking for you to accept him as your Savior, there is so much in the teachings of Christ that would make for a far better world if even non-believers practiced it. I mean, he was an advocate of things like honesty, a compassionate heart, treating others fairly. He was an advocate of justice. He was an advocate of people getting what is their due. He was opposed to the use of force. He advised people to turn the other cheek. I mean, there's so much in the Christian message that is abundantly wise and desirous, whether you accept the central theological point of Christ's divinity or not.
Let's keep going on this then, and let's look at the first request in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. He doesn't say remove all government obstacles so we can earn our daily bread. It sounds more like asking for alms.
But from whom? Who is the prayer addressed to? He doesn't say, now, address your prayer to the government. He's asking you to address your prayers to the Father and asking the Father to give us our daily bread. Now, what does he mean by that? Does he mean that people should be asking God to put a loaf of bread in a bag and on their doorstep? No. What he's saying is ask for God's guidance, ask for God to give you the strength that you need to provide for yourself and your family. But I don't see in those words anything that says, pray to your emperor and ask him to give you something at other people's expense. I mean, that is all just such a leap from what Christ is saying. I don't know how people can read that into it.
Let's go to the next line. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Does that make all bankers sinners?
Not at all. In fact, some translations, of course, use the term trespass and trespasses as opposed to debts. So it's probably even more apparent with the use of the term trespasses that he's talking about not an honest contractual debt, but rather a harm, a wrong that someone has done. Forgive us for the wrongs we've done to others. I think that's the more proper meaning.
Lay not up for yourselves treasure upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. How is this compatible with the accumulation of an investment of capital, which is absolutely required to make a modern free market work?
Christ is not speaking as an economist or a political scientist. He's speaking as a messenger of the Father, and he's trying to prick the consciences of people, touch their hearts, and he's calling them to have their eyes on something higher than this earthly world. If you take that comment in context of all of his message, you don't find him railing against the accumulation of wealth. In fact, the parable of the talents involves the praise of someone who took his talents, a form of money, and turned it into the greatest, highest returns. I think what he's saying here is, don't put your focus on the accumulation of material wealth at the expense of your spiritual life and your ultimate well-being and destination. But that doesn't mean don't accumulate wealth or that there's anything wrong with it.
How does that square with these two lines, which are so memorable? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. How does that work in an economy?
I think what he's implying there is that there is a kind of Now, this may seem like a leap for you, Bill, but I see that as a suggestion that there is a natural order. There's a spontaneous order that when people are left free, they go in multiple directions. They seek to accumulate wealth, but all of that in an earthly sense is not all of life. And that Christ is telling us that there is one thing, at least one thing, far more important than anything you can do in your short earthly life, and that is to focus on your spiritual destination.
So this is not an admonition like in the Bhagavad Gita against fructive labor, that is, working hard in anticipation of a future reward. He's not saying that.
No, if we read it that way, it would be inconsistent with every other passage that may be clearer, but that would not seem to call for redistribution or for any kind of opposition to the accumulation of wealth. Christ's focus is always on spiritual renewal, upon choices that a person makes freely, knowing the consequences of his actions. I don't see anything that calls upon political authorities to settle matters of who owns what and who's entitled to what.
Let's push ahead to one of the passages that's most problematic for me, particularly if you believe in the importance of justice. Judge not that ye be not judged. What does that mean?
Christ is talking about the judgment that we often, as Christians and even non-Christians, engage in about where a person's heart is and where their ultimate destination may be. You've heard people say, oh, he or she is going to hell because of their bad behavior. Christ would be the first to say, don't judge that person. First of all, you don't know everything there is to know about that person's heart, and you don't know how things may change in that person's life. To claim today that a person is bound in one direction or another because of his past choices is a pretense to knowledge of what his future choices may be. And Christ always taught redemption and the betterment of one's life and destination by personal choice.
So this is not about the enforcement of contracts. You have to have judgment for that.
Oh, yeah. And I think he, in other places, talks about the importance of upholding contract. The parable of the laborers in the vineyard is a strong endorsement of private contract and association. So to interpret the judging part that you just cited as a case against justice would be, again, another leap.
It's always fun to play with these passages and put one aside the other. We run out of material pretty quickly. Jesus didn't leave a lot of writings behind, and we have to rely much on the modern churches that claim to speak in his name. And I know that although Pope Francis speaks for all the Catholics don't speak for all the Christians. A lot was said about his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, particularly the economic portions of that, and perhaps we can spend a couple minutes on that. He quotes at one point St. John Chrysostom saying, "Not to share one's wealth with the poor is to steal from them and take away their livelihood. It is not our own goods which we hold, but theirs." Now, if that doesn't sound like socialism, I don't know what is.
Well, I think that Francis is running off in an unjustified direction. I wish he would have paid more attention to the teachings of two popes prior, John Paul II, who I think in Centesimus Annus, his great encyclical on economics, said some pretty strong things in favor of a free economy and against socialist redistribution. I'm not a Catholic and I'm not a fan of this pope, but I sure like the one 2 popes ago.
Well, Larry, Pope John Paul II grew up under the depredations of communism, but Pope Francis was educated under liberation theology in South America. Do you think that bears somewhat on his views?
I think absolutely Pope Francis's background has influenced his thinking, just as John Paul II's background influenced his. John Paul II grew up under socialism. He was an extremely observant man. He understood that concentrating power inevitably produces great harm to society, economically and spiritually. Francis is more influenced, I think, by some of the liberation theologians who have been of such great harm in South America. Ultimately, it's just hard for me to imagine that Christ or Christianity would endorse programs in an earthly sense that don't work, that impoverish people. And the fact is that free economies accomplish far more for the poor than any other arrangements. And I just wish Pope Francis understood that as well as John Paul II understood it. But these are both human beings. They are flawed. They're not infallible. And some popes are better than others, and John Paul II was the best in my lifetime.
So, Larry, how did Christ's teachings about character influence your views of economics?
Bill, I've always been greatly influenced from my teen years by what I understood to be the teachings of Christ. Everywhere he has, in the Bible, talked about the importance of high standards of personal character. Some of those aspects are quite spiritual in nature. Others are very earthly and very current in the sense that he supports and praises things like being honest in your dealings and treating others in a just and fair fashion, keeping your word, being patient, being as self-reliant as you possibly can. Try not to be a burden on others. Try to be as successful as you can be so that you're in a position to help other people. Do the right thing because you choose to, not because there's a gun at your head or a politician at your back trying to force you to do the right thing. All of that, to me, underscores the importance in Christian teaching of being a person of strong, high character, who's a good example for his friends and family around him.
Well, Larry, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. It's always a pleasure to chat.
Thank you. Same to you, Bill.
That was Larry Reed, president of the Foundation for Economic Education, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. If you like this sort of thoughtful radio, please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Ahead, Samuel Gregg from the Acton Institute discusses the economics of Christian justice, mercy, freedom, sacrifice, love, guilt, shame, and envy. Stay tuned.